The warm aroma of roasted chicken and baked potatoes filled the tidy suburban kitchen as Sarah carefully adjusted the tablecloth. She took a step back and surveyed her work: clean white plates, polished silverware, and a small vase of daisies at the center. It was Kyle's birthday dinner, his 14th, to be exact, and she wanted everything to be perfect. "Mom, Elijah's here." Kyle's voice rang out excitedly from the front door. Sarah sighed softly, brushing invisible lint from her apron. Elijah. The boy had been around for years, practically a fixture in Kyle's life, but there was always something about him that unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It wasn't that Elijah was rude or troublesome; in fact, he was polite, helpful, and never complained. But Sarah couldn't shake a strange sense of unease whenever he was around. Elijah walked in with his signature bright smile, his hands holding a small, neatly wrapped gift. "Hey, Mrs. Thompson," he said politely, offering a nod. "Happy birthday, Kyle." "Hey, man." Kyle ran up to Elijah and gave him a playful punch on the shoulder. "Come in. We're about to eat." Sarah smiled faintly but found her eyes lingering on Elijah as he handed Kyle the gift. The boy was tall for his age, broad-shouldered with gentle, dark eyes that made it hard to read his thoughts. He wore a clean, pressed sweatshirt and jeans, a pair of sneakers just slightly too worn at the edges. Kyle tore at the wrapping paper with glee, holding up a sleek-looking baseball glove. "Whoa, Elijah, this is awesome!" Kyle exclaimed, turning it over in his hands. "Thank you." Elijah shrugged modestly. "You always said you wanted a new glove." Sarah gave a polite nod. "That was very thoughtful of you, Elijah." Her words were kind enough, but there was a stiffness to them, and Elijah seemed to pick up on it. "It's no big deal," he replied softly, his gaze dropping for just a moment before he followed Kyle to the living room. The evening passed with the comforting murmur of conversations, the sound of utensils clinking against plates, and Kyle's bursts of laughter echoing through the house. Sarah noticed how Elijah seamlessly blended into the family scene. He helped Kyle carry dishes to the sink after dinner without being asked, and even helped Sarah's brother, Mike, pull a stubborn cork from a wine bottle. But Sarah's unease persisted, her gaze flicking to Elijah from time to time as though waiting for something. "Mom, you're staring again," Kyle whispered teasingly, jolting Sarah from her thoughts. He grinned, misinterpreting her mood. "You're not nervous about the party going well, are you?" Sarah forced a smile. "No, honey. I'm just making sure everything stays in order." It wasn't a lie, not exactly. But it wasn't the whole truth either. After dinner, while the adults sipped coffee and Kyle and Elijah joked in the living room, Sarah excused herself to tidy up. As she passed through the dining area, her gaze drifted to the bookshelf where her late father's wristwatch, a vintage, silver-cased heirloom, usually sat on display. Her steps slowed. The spot where the watch had always rested was empty. Sarah frowned, a prickle of unease crawling up her spine. She walked over and touched the empty space as if her hands might summon it back. She scanned the shelves, moving aside a few decorative knickknacks. Nothing. Her pulse quickened. Her mind immediately leaped to possibilities. Did Mike move it? Did Kyle take it to show Elijah? But then another, darker thought crept in uninvited, one she pushed away but couldn't quite silence. No. Sarah turned back toward the living room, where Elijah sat beside Kyle, laughing about something on Kyle's phone. The watch couldn't have simply disappeared. "Everything okay, Mom?" Kyle called out, noticing her hesitation. Sarah gave a forced smile. "Yes. I just need to check something." "Excuse me for a moment." She stepped briskly upstairs, retracing her own actions from earlier. Had she misplaced it? She checked her bedroom, the hallway table, and the bathroom shelf where she sometimes left jewelry after cleaning. Nothing. The watch was nowhere to be found. Her heart began to thud dully in her chest. Back downstairs, the cheerful atmosphere felt like an echo of itself. Sarah sat stiffly on the armrest of a chair, her mind elsewhere. She glanced at Elijah, who was now leaning forward, gesturing animatedly as he told a story. His laughter mixed with Kyle's, loud and unburdened. "Did you lose something?" Mike asked quietly, leaning in so the boys wouldn't hear. Sarah shook her head slowly, her jaw tight. "I don't know. Maybe." But as the minutes passed, her thoughts tangled and frayed. She had to ask. She couldn't let it slide. Elijah," Sarah said abruptly, interrupting the boys' laughter. Her voice was calm, but it carried an edge that hadn't been there earlier. Elijah's smile faltered. "Yes, ma'am. I just realized something. My father's watch. It's missing." The room went still. Kyle's expression froze mid-laugh. Elijah blinked, caught off guard. I haven't seen it," Elijah said, his voice steady but confused. Sarah tilted her head, her gaze narrowing just slightly. "You were helping Kyle near the dining area earlier. Are you sure you didn't see anything?" Elijah's confusion deepened. "I swear I didn't see it, Mrs. Thompson. I didn't touch anything like that." "Mom," Kyle said sharply, his face turning red. "Why are you asking him that?" "I'm just trying to figure out what happened," Sarah replied coolly, though her hands gripped the edge of her apron tightly. "It's an expensive heirloom. I just want to make sure." Elijah stood slowly, the warmth drained from his face. "Mrs. Thompson, I would never take anything from you. I promise." Kyle jumped up. "He didn't do anything." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Elijah's expression silenced her. The hurt in his eyes was impossible to ignore. "I think I should go," Elijah said quietly. "Elijah, don't," Kyle started, but Elijah was already grabbing his coat. The door clicked shut moments later, leaving the house quieter than it had been all night. "Why did you do that?" Kyle's voice trembled with anger. "Elijah didn't take your stupid watch. Why would you even think that?" Sarah stood rooted to the floor, the weight of her son's words pressing on her chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The door's soft thud echoed through the quiet house, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Kyle stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides, glaring at his mother as if she had turned into a stranger. Sarah tried to steady herself, her mind still tangled in the aftermath of Elijah's departure. "Kyle," she began softly. "No!" Kyle shouted, his voice cracking. "You had no right to accuse him like that. Elijah's my best friend, and you," he stopped himself, his voice trembling. "You embarrassed him. You embarrassed me." Sarah flinched. "I wasn't accusing anyone," she said defensively. "I was just asking a question." "There's a difference." Kyle let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, sure. Just asking. Like you weren't already blaming him." Sarah's chest tightened. "Kyle, you don't understand. The watch. I don't care about the stupid watch," he snapped. "It's just a thing. You care about it more than you care about what you did to Elijah. He didn't deserve that." He turned on his heel and stormed upstairs, his footsteps heavy and angry on the stairs. Sarah stood motionless, her mind reeling. "I wasn't accusing him," she repeated to herself silently. But the memory of Elijah's face, his confusion, his hurt, nagged at her. Later that evening, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a half-empty mug of tea. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of Kyle's music playing behind his closed bedroom door. She stared at the spot on the bookshelf where her father's watch had always sat. It wasn't just an object, it was a reminder of him, of the years they spent together before he passed. It had survived decades, passed down from her grandfather. Her mind circled back to the evening. Could it have been Elijah? She hated to admit it, even to herself, but the thought wouldn't leave her. He'd been right there, close enough to see the watch, close enough to... "No," she muttered aloud, shaking her head as if to clear the thought. She didn't know anything for certain. But wasn't she allowed to ask questions? She sighed, rubbing her temples. The ache of guilt, if that's what it was, settled heavily on her shoulders. The next day, Kyle refused to come downstairs for breakfast. Sarah knocked on his door, her tone softer than usual. "Kyle, honey? I made pancakes." No answer. "Can we just talk, please?" she pressed. "I know you're upset." Finally, the door creaked open a few inches. Kyle's face appeared, his expression tired and guarded. "Did you call Elijah?" he asked flatly. Sarah blinked. "What?" "You need to apologize, Mom. You have to call him and tell him you were wrong." Sarah hesitated. "Kyle, He slammed the door in her face before she could finish. By mid-afternoon, Sarah found herself in the living room, flipping through a photo album she hadn't opened in years. She paused on a picture of Kyle and Elijah from when they were 10, both grinning and covered in mud after an afternoon spent playing baseball in the rain. Elijah had been there through everything, helping Kyle with homework, staying over during storms when Kyle was too scared to sleep alone. He was always smiling, always ready to lend a hand. Sarah remembered him helping her carry groceries to the car more than once. Still, her thoughts whispered again, but he was there when the watch disappeared. The doorbell rang, interrupting her reverie. Sarah stood, surprised to see her brother, Mike, standing on the porch. He held a small box of tools, his brow furrowed. "Everything okay here?" Mike asked, stepping inside. Sarah gestured vaguely toward the living room. "It's fine." "Why?" "Kyle texted me," Mike said bluntly. "He's worried about Elijah." "Said you accused the kid of stealing?" Sarah's mouth went dry. "I didn't accuse him. I just asked if he saw the watch." Mike set his tools down and looked at her. "That's not how Kyle made it sound." "He's really upset, Sarah. And if you're wrong about this—" "I might not be wrong," she interrupted defensively. "The watch didn't just vanish." Mike raised an eyebrow. "Sarah, come on. That kid wouldn't take anything. He's always been good to Kyle. And to you, for that matter." Sarah turned away, her arms crossed tightly. "I just want to know the truth." Mike exhaled slowly. "You ever think about what this is doing to Kyle? To that kid Elijah? If you're wrong, this isn't the kind of thing people forget. You could hurt them both." Sarah flinched at his words. "I'm just trying to protect what's important to me," she mumbled. Mike's voice softened. "What's more important, Sarah, a watch, or your son's best friend?" That evening, Kyle sat alone at the dinner table, barely touching his food. Sarah watched him, the silence between them heavy. "Kyle," she said finally, her voice low, "I didn't mean to hurt Elijah." Kyle didn't look up. "You did." "I was just trying to figure out what happened," she continued carefully. "I never said I knew for sure." Kyle's fork clattered against his plate as he dropped it. "Does it matter? You made him feel like he didn't belong here. He trusted you, Mom. And you," he shook his head, his voice breaking. "You let him down." Sarah's throat tightened. But the words wouldn't come. She watched Kyle push his plate aside and leave the table. The sound of his bedroom door closing echoed through the house. Sarah sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, staring at the empty spot on the shelf again. The watch was gone. So was the peace in her house. The house felt different the next morning. The sunlight that usually streamed cheerfully through the kitchen windows seemed duller, muted by the heavy quiet that had settled overnight. Sarah sat at the breakfast table with her coffee, watching the steam swirl from the mug. Across from her sat an empty chair, Kyle's chair. He hadn't come down. Her chest tightened. She knew Kyle was angry, but this kind of silence felt unbearable. He'd always been chatty in the mornings, teasing her about the way she burned toast or telling her about Elijah's ridiculous jokes. Now it was just her and the clock ticking on the wall. "He'll come around," she told herself, taking a sip of the lukewarm coffee. "It's just a fight. Mothers and sons fight sometimes." She didn't believe it. Not really. Upstairs, Kyle lay on his bed, headphones on, staring blankly at the ceiling. His phone buzzed beside him, a text from Elijah. Elijah, hey, man. You good? Elijah, haven't heard from you. Call me when you can. Kyle shut his eyes, feeling a wave of guilt he didn't know how to fix. He wanted to text back, to tell Elijah he was sorry for everything, but what would he even say? His mom, his own mom, had been the one to accuse Elijah of stealing. There weren't enough words to take that back. Sarah spent the afternoon restlessly cleaning the house, as though wiping down surfaces might clear her mind. She found herself wandering into Kyle's room when he wasn't there. It felt like trespassing, but she needed something, anything, that would help her understand her son better. Her eyes landed on a framed photo on his desk, Kyle and Elijah at their middle school graduation, arms slung over each other's shoulders. They were grinning ear to ear, Elijah holding up Kyle's honor roll certificate like it was his own. The image tugged at something inside her, and her fingers traced the edge of the frame. Elijah had always been there for Kyle, hadn't he? Through scraped knees, failed math tests, and the summer baseball tournaments where the boys sat on the bench more than they played. She lowered the frame, a pang of guilt twisting in her stomach. Could I really have been so wrong? Later that evening, Sarah knocked softly on Kyle's door, holding a plate of his favorite spaghetti. Can I come in? She asked. There was no response. After a long pause, she opened the door and found him sitting at his desk, slouched over his phone. I thought you might be hungry, Sarah said, setting the plate down on his desk. You didn't eat much today. Kyle didn't look up. I'm not hungry. Sarah hesitated by the door, searching for the right words. Kyle, do you still think Elijah took the watch? Kyle cut her off, his voice flat. Sarah blinked. I don't know what to think. Kyle finally turned to face her. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his jaw was set. If you don't know, then why did you make him feel like you did? His words struck her harder than she expected. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. You don't get it, Mom. Elijah's like a brother to me. He didn't deserve that. Sarah took a shaky breath. Kyle, I didn't mean to hurt him. I needed to know what happened. Kyle shook his head and stood up, brushing past her toward the door. Whatever. I'm going to Mike's. Wait. But he was already gone, leaving Sarah alone again, with nothing but the lingering scent of spaghetti and the gnawing ache in her chest. That night, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty bookshelf in the corner of her room. She'd moved her father's watch to that shelf 3 years ago, after he passed. It was supposed to remind her of him, the man who had taught her to be strong, to protect what mattered. And yet, here she was, feeling like a failure on both counts. Mike's words echoed in her mind from the day before. What's more important, Sarah, a watch, or your son's best friend? She sighed, rubbing her temples as memories washed over her. Elijah carrying groceries. Elijah cracking jokes. Elijah helping fix the broken screen door last summer. He'd never once asked for anything in return. Sarah's throat tightened. What if I was wrong? She picked up her phone, staring at the contact list. Elijah's mother's number was there. She'd gotten it years ago when the boys had first become friends. Her thumb hovered over the screen. You need to apologize, Kyle's voice echoed in her head. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, she set the phone down and lay back in bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside her window, the crickets chirped in the cool night air, oblivious to the storm brewing inside her. The next morning, Sarah awoke to an empty house. Kyle's note sat on the kitchen table in his familiar scrawl. At Uncle Mike's. Won't be back until dinner. Don't wait up. Sarah set the note down, a heavy weight settling in her chest. The silence that had filled the house yesterday now felt permanent, like something had cracked deep in their family that couldn't be so easily fixed. She looked out the window at the empty street, the morning light streaming in again. The house was still and quiet, too quiet. Sarah knew one thing for certain. She couldn't keep ignoring the damage she'd caused. She had to figure out how to make it right. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when Kyle returned home. Sarah sat in the living room, the low hum of the TV filling the silence. She glanced up as the front door opened, but Kyle didn't say a word. He dropped his backpack by the door, gave her a brief glance, and started upstairs. "Kyle, wait," Sarah said, rising from the couch. He froze on the stairs but didn't turn around. "What? Can we talk? Please?" Kyle sighed audibly, turning to face her. His face was drawn and guarded, like a wall she couldn't get past. "About what?" Sarah stepped closer, clasping her hands nervously. "About Elijah. About what happened." Kyle's shoulders tensed. "You don't have to keep talking about it, Mom. You made your feelings pretty clear." "No, Kyle, listen. I've been thinking about it, and maybe Kyle cut her off sharply. "Maybe you what? Maybe you accused him for no reason? Maybe you let your own messed up assumptions ruin everything?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "That's not fair. I wasn't accusing him. I was just asking." "Stop saying that." Kyle's voice rose, the frustration boiling over. "You did accuse him. You looked him right in the eye and made him feel like garbage in our own house. How do you think that felt, Mom? Huh? How do you think I felt?" Sarah took a shaky breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "Kyle, I didn't mean to hurt him. I just didn't know what else to do when the watch went missing." Kyle's face twisted in disbelief. "So you went after Elijah? My best friend? The one person who's never done anything wrong to us? Just because he happened to be here?" Sarah opened her mouth, but she had no defense. "Because he happened to be here." The words stung because they were true. Kyle's expression darkened as a thought seemed to occur to him. "Would you have said anything if it were someone else? If it were Mike? Or one of your friends? Or," he hesitated, his voice dropping, "or if Elijah didn't look the way he does?" Sarah's eyes widened. "Kyle, that's not fair. Isn't it?" he shot back, his voice trembling. "Because that's exactly what it felt like, Mom." Sarah couldn't answer. The truth, the ugly truth, stared back at her in the form of her son's accusations. She wanted to deny it, to insist that her instincts hadn't been shaped by prejudice, but deep down she didn't know if she believed herself. Kyle turned sharply and stomped up the stairs, his door slamming shut behind him. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Sarah moved aimlessly through the house, stopping occasionally to glance at old family photos on the walls, pictures of Kyle's childhood, of birthdays and holidays, of the three of them laughing. She paused at a photo of Kyle and Elijah at a summer baseball game, arms wrapped around each other's shoulders as they grinned at the camera. She hadn't realized how many of those moments Elijah had been part of until now. By the next morning, Kyle was gone before Sarah even woke up. A quick text from Mike confirmed that Kyle had stayed over at his uncle's place again. "He said he needs space," Mike's message read. "You've gotta fix this, Sarah. Don't let it drag on." Sarah dropped the phone on the table, running a hand over her face. She felt like she was losing Kyle, bit by bit, with every hour that passed. And Elijah. Her thoughts drifted to him again, and a fresh wave of guilt hit her. She imagined his face that night, confused, hurt, betrayed, and her stomach twisted. She needed to fix this, but how? That afternoon, Sarah stood at the foot of Kyle's bed, staring at the clutter he had left behind. His baseball cap sat on the nightstand next to a stack of comic books, and his backpack lay half unzipped on the floor. She crouched beside it, ready to tidy things up, but stopped when she noticed something sticking out of the front pocket. It was a small leather pouch. Frowning, Sarah carefully pulled it out. Her hands froze when she opened it and saw the edge of her father's silver watch. The room spun. For a moment, all she could do was stare at the watch, the truth slamming into her like a punch to the gut. Kyle. Kyle had hidden it. Her fingers trembled as she set the watch down. "Oh, God," she whispered, sinking onto the edge of the bed. She thought back to everything she'd said and done, her accusatory questions, Elijah's denial, Kyle's anger, and felt the weight of it all crash over her. She had accused an innocent boy. She had let her assumptions tear apart a friendship, hurt her son, and humiliate someone who had only ever been kind. And now she knew why Kyle had been so angry. That evening, Sarah sat alone at the dinner table, the watch resting in front of her. She ran her thumb over its smooth, polished surface, remembering her father and the lessons he'd tried to teach her about integrity and fairness. The door creaked open, and Kyle entered the house. His gaze immediately went to the watch in Sarah's hand, and his face paled. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "In your backpack." Kyle swallowed hard and looked down, shame flooding his face. I didn't mean for it to turn into this. His voice cracked. "You never listen to me anymore, Mom. You're always so busy or distracted, and I thought maybe if you thought it was gone, you'd pay attention." Sarah's heart broke at the confession. "Kyle." He shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "I didn't think you'd blame Elijah. I didn't think you'd do that." Sarah stood slowly, crossing the room to stand in front of him. She reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Kyle, I messed up," she said softly. "I didn't listen to you. I didn't think. And I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." Kyle looked up at her, his face searching hers. "What are you going to do?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her actions settle over her shoulders. "I'm going to make it right." The house was quiet again, but this silence felt different, heavier, as though the truth itself lingered in the air. Sarah sat in the living room with the watch resting in her hands, turning it over slowly. The smooth, silver surface reflected the faint glow of the overhead light, a sharp contrast to the turmoil twisting in her chest. How could I have let it come to this? Kyle had gone to bed without another word, leaving her alone to wrestle with her thoughts. The confession still echoed in her mind. He hadn't hidden the watch to hurt her, he had done it because he felt unseen. That knowledge stung far deeper than any accusation she'd made. And Elijah. Sarah winced at the memory of his face. She had looked him in the eye and doubted him. Humiliated him. She couldn't deny it now, her mind had made a leap that she never would have made with someone else. That truth was impossible to ignore. She set the watch down gently on the coffee table and leaned back, closing her eyes. Images of Elijah flooded her thoughts, his bright smile, his helpful nature, the way he and Kyle had been inseparable for years. He'd been like family. And she'd made him feel like he didn't belong. Unable to sit still any longer, Sarah found herself wandering into the hallway where her family photos lined the walls. She stopped at a picture of Kyle's 10th birthday party. It was a sunny afternoon, and the kids were all huddled around a picnic table, faces smeared with cake frosting. Kyle and Elijah sat side by side at the center, laughing so hard they were nearly falling off their seats. Sarah smiled faintly, brushing her finger over the glass. She could still hear their voices from that day. "Elijah, you're getting frosting all over your face." Kyle had howled. "It's called style, dude," Elijah had shot back with a grin, making everyone laugh harder. The memory brought a lump to her throat. How had she let herself forget moments like that? How had she allowed suspicion, however brief or unintended, to cloud years of trust? She moved to the next picture, Elijah and Kyle at a baseball game, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. Kyle had struck out twice that day, but Elijah never left his side, even when the other boys teased him. "Why'd you stick with me?" Kyle had asked later, embarrassed. "Because friends don't leave," Elijah had replied, simple and firm. Sarah's chest tightened as those words played in her head. Friends don't leave. And yet, she had pushed Elijah away. The following morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with a blank notepad and pen. She had barely slept, but her mind was clearer now. The weight of her guilt hadn't lifted, but it had sharpened into resolve. "You have to make this right," she told herself firmly. She glanced at the watch again, its presence both a reminder and a motivator, and thought of Elijah. She needed to face him, to own her mistakes, but the thought of it filled her with a quiet dread. What if he doesn't forgive me? What if I've ruined everything for good? The thought of facing Elijah's mother was no easier. Sarah had known her for years, though only in the polite, distant way neighbors often do. How could she explain herself? How could she make them see that she wasn't the person her actions had made her out to be? But it didn't matter how hard it was going to be. She owed it to Elijah, to Kyle, and to herself to try. Around mid-morning, Sarah drove to her brother Mike's house. Kyle had spent the night there again, and Sarah knew she couldn't keep avoiding him. When Mike opened the door, his face softened as he took in her expression. "You look like you haven't slept in days." "I haven't," Sarah admitted. "Is Kyle here?" Mike nodded. "He's out back." Sarah walked through the house, her footsteps heavy on the hardwood floors. Outside, Kyle sat on the porch steps, idly tossing a baseball into the air and catching it. He didn't look up when Sarah stepped outside. "Hey," she said softly. Kyle shrugged in response, his gaze fixed on the baseball. "I found the watch," she continued, sitting down beside him. "You were right about Elijah, and she swallowed hard. I owe him an apology. I owe you an apology, too." Kyle's hand stilled, and the baseball dropped into his lap. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "So what are you going to do?" Sarah met his gaze. "I'm going to talk to him. And his mom. I have to make this right." Kyle nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers as if testing the sincerity of her words. "Good." The faintest flicker of relief crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant. "You should have trusted him, Mom," he said quietly. "You should have trusted me." Sarah's throat tightened. "I know. And I'm sorry, Kyle." He didn't say anything else, but after a moment, he reached over and handed her the baseball. Sarah looked down at it, surprised, then smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was something. That afternoon, Sarah sat in her car, parked outside Elijah's house. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her heart pounding. The small, blue house with its neatly trimmed lawn and wind chimes on the porch looked the same as always, but Sarah had never felt so out of place. She saw the curtains move slightly and realized Elijah's mother had spotted her. There was no turning back now. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, clutching the small box with her father's watch inside. As she approached the door, her hands felt clammy, and her throat went dry. Before she could knock, the door opened. Elijah's mother stood there, her expression calm but cautious. "Sarah," she said evenly. "Hi, Denise." Sarah forced a weak smile. "Can we talk?" Denise looked her over for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Sarah stepped into the small living room, clutching the box containing the watch so tightly her knuckles turned white. The room was warm and cozy, with family photos lining the walls and the faint smell of baked bread drifting in from the kitchen. She had been here before, years ago, when Kyle and Elijah had playdates. Back then, the house had felt so welcoming, now it felt as though the walls were watching her. Denise gestured for Sarah to sit on the couch. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked politely, though her voice carried an edge of formality. "No, thank you," Sarah replied quietly, sitting with her back straight and her hands still clutching the box. Denise sat down in the armchair across from her. Her expression was calm, but Sarah could see the guarded concern in her eyes. "You're here to talk about what happened," Denise said evenly. It wasn't a question. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes." There was a beat of silence before she spoke again. "Denise, she hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I made a terrible mistake." Denise tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Go on." Sarah opened the box and placed it gently on the coffee table between them. The silver watch gleamed under the light. Denise's eyes flicked to it, then back to Sarah, waiting. Sarah cleared her throat. It wasn't Elijah, she said softly. Kyle. Kyle took the watch. I found it in his backpack yesterday. A flicker of something passed across Denise's face, surprise, perhaps, or relief, but she said nothing, letting Sarah continue. I accused Elijah of something he didn't do, Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. I didn't stop to think. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I hurt him. I humiliated him. And I am so sorry. Denise studied Sarah in silence, her gaze sharp and searching. Sarah felt the weight of it, her stomach churning with shame. My son came home that night devastated, Denise said finally, her voice low but steady. He didn't say much, but I could tell. He's been through things like this before, Sarah. You're not the first person who's looked at him and assumed the worst. Sarah winced, the words cutting deep. I never wanted to be that person, she whispered. But I was. I was wrong. Denise sighed softly, her shoulders relaxing just a little. What are you going to do now? Sarah took a deep breath. I want to apologize to Elijah. Face to face. If he'll let me. Denise studied her for another long moment, then nodded. Wait here. The minutes dragged as Sarah sat on the couch, staring at the watch as if it might offer her answers. She could hear footsteps upstairs, then the soft creak of the stairs as someone descended. Her heart pounded harder with each step. Elijah appeared in the doorway, his tall frame tense, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie. He hesitated when he saw Sarah, his expression guarded. Hey, Elijah, Denise said gently. Sarah's here to talk to you. Elijah glanced at his mother before stepping further into the room. He looked at Sarah, but there was no smile on his face this time, only a quiet weariness. Sarah stood, her hands shaking slightly. Elijah, her voice broke, and she took a moment to steady herself. I owe you an apology. A real one. Elijah said nothing, his gaze unwavering. I accused you of something you didn't do, she continued. I made assumptions. I let myself believe something that was never true, and I hurt you. I'm so sorry, Elijah. You didn't deserve that. He stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. Why did you think it was me? The question hit Sarah harder than she expected. Her mouth opened, but the words didn't come right away. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I thought I knew who you were, someone I could trust. But when the watch disappeared, I let my fear and my assumptions take over. And I see now that those assumptions weren't fair to you. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. Because I'm black? He asked, his voice calm but pointed. Sarah's breath caught. The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. I think, she hesitated, forcing herself to be honest. I think part of me judged you unfairly because of that. And I hate that it's true. Elijah looked away, his jaw tightening, but he didn't leave. Sarah felt the tears sting her eyes. You've been nothing but kind to our family. To me. You're Kyle's best friend, Elijah. You've been like family to us, and I let you down. I'm so sorry. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Elijah looked back at her. You hurt me, he said simply. I know, Sarah replied softly. And I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, Elijah. You don't have to forgive me, but I hope someday you will. Elijah stared at her for a long time, his expression slowly softening. He shifted on his feet, pulling his hands out of his pockets. Kyle's been texting me, he said finally. He told me you figured it out. Sarah nodded. He was angry with me, and he was right to be. Elijah looked down at the watch on the table, then back at Sarah. I don't know if I forgive you yet, he said honestly. But I believe you're sorry. Sarah nodded, her tears spilling over. Thank you for giving me the chance to say it. Denise placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, squeezing it gently. It takes a lot of strength to say you're sorry, Sarah, she said softly. And it takes even more to forgive. Elijah gave a small nod, his shoulders relaxing just a little. Can I see Kyle soon? He asked. Sarah smiled through her tears. Of course. I think he needs you just as much as you need him. Elijah's lips curved into a faint smile, the first one she'd seen since that awful night. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that afternoon, Sarah drove home, the watch safely tucked back into its box beside her. The conversation had been hard, harder than she'd imagined, but it had also been necessary. When she walked into the house, Kyle was waiting in the living room, sitting on the couch with his phone in his hands. He looked up as Sarah entered, his face wary. Well, he asked. Sarah sat down beside him, her voice soft but steady. I apologized. To Elijah and to his mom. He's not ready to forgive me yet, but I think he believes I'm sorry. Kyle looked down at his phone, then back at Sarah. Can I text him and ask him to come over? Sarah smiled, her heart aching with relief. Of course, honey. I think that would be perfect. Kyle didn't wait another second. He began typing quickly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As Sarah watched him, the house finally began to feel a little warmer again. The house felt different as the evening settled in. For the first time in days, Sarah wasn't carrying the same crushing weight. She had done the hardest part, she'd faced Elijah and his mother. Now, she had to focus on fixing the cracks her actions had left in her family and in Kyle's friendship. The sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs made her look up. Kyle came bounding into the living room, his phone clutched in his hand and a rare smile on his face. Elijah's coming over, he announced breathlessly. He said he'll be here in, 10 minutes. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. That's great, she said softly. I'm glad. Kyle looked at her carefully, his smile fading slightly. You're really okay with it? Sarah met his eyes. Of course I am, Kyle. Elijah's always been welcome here. She hesitated, then added, I just hope he knows that now. Kyle nodded, studying her for a moment before retreating back upstairs. Sarah exhaled slowly. He's coming here, she thought. Her stomach fluttered with nerves. She had apologized to Elijah earlier, but this felt like something more, like inviting him back into a space she had once poisoned with doubt. The knock at the door came exactly 10 minutes later. Kyle beat Sarah to it, throwing the door open with such excitement that it felt like he hadn't seen Elijah in years. Hey, man. Kyle said, his voice bursting with relief. Hey. Elijah stepped in with a shy smile, his hands tucked into his hoodie pockets. His sneakers squeaked faintly on the hardwood floor as he entered, his gaze briefly meeting Sarah's before flickering away. Come on, let's go upstairs, Kyle said quickly, eager to escape the tension that still lingered. Wait, Sarah said softly, stepping forward. Both boys stopped. Elijah, she began, her voice steady but gentle. I just want to say again how sorry I am for what I did. I know that I can't take it back, but I want you to know that I'm working to be better. Elijah looked at her carefully for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. Okay. It wasn't a full forgiveness, she knew that much, but it was something. Kyle grinned and grabbed Elijah's arm. Come on. I've got a new game to show you. The two boys disappeared up the stairs, their laughter trailing behind them. For the first time in days, the sound filled the house like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sarah stood in the quiet entryway for a moment, a small smile tugging at her lips. The rest of the evening passed peacefully. Sarah sat in the living room, letting the familiar hum of life return to her house. She could hear the boys upstairs, their muffled voices and bursts of laughter reminding her of how things used to be. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Later that night, when Elijah came downstairs to grab a glass of water, Sarah paused in the doorway of the kitchen. Do you need anything else? She asked softly. No, I'm good, Elijah replied, his tone polite but distant. Sarah hesitated. You and Kyle, your friendship means a lot to him, Elijah. And it means a lot to me, too. Elijah looked at her, his expression guarded but curious. "Why'd you think I took it?" The question came out so suddenly that it caught Sarah off guard. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to answer honestly. "I don't know, Elijah," she admitted, meeting his eyes. "Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was old habits I didn't even realize I had. But it was wrong. I see that now." Elijah studied her for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Thanks for saying that." He turned and headed back upstairs, leaving Sarah standing alone in the kitchen. It's not fixed yet, she thought. But maybe it will be someday. The next morning, Sarah woke early and found herself staring at the empty spot on the bookshelf where the watch had once sat. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt like the heavy, suffocating silence from before. It felt like something lighter, like hope. She picked up the watch from the coffee table, turning it over in her hands. It still carried the weight of her father's memory, but now it felt like something else, too, a symbol of how easily trust and relationships could shatter when fear took hold. With care, Sarah placed the watch back on the shelf, right where it belonged. A few days later, Sarah stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when she heard laughter from the backyard. She glanced out the window and saw Kyle and Elijah tossing a baseball back and forth, their voices ringing out through the cool autumn air. Sarah watched them for a moment, smiling faintly. The sight filled her chest with something warm, relief, perhaps, or gratitude. The back door opened, and Kyle poked his head inside. "Mom, we're gonna go to the park with some of the guys. Is that okay?" "Of course," Sarah replied. "Be home by dark." "Got it," Kyle said with a grin before disappearing again. Elijah followed, pausing briefly in the doorway. "Thanks for letting me come over," he said quietly. "You're always welcome here, Elijah," Sarah said softly, meeting his gaze. "Always." For the first time in days, Elijah gave her a small but genuine smile. Then he turned and jogged back to the yard to catch up with Kyle. Sarah watched them go, the two boys laughing and shouting as they disappeared down the street. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. Maybe it's not perfect, she thought. But we're getting there. That night, Sarah and Kyle sat together at the dinner table for the first time in days. It wasn't much, just spaghetti and garlic bread, but it felt like a celebration of something unspoken. "So Elijah's mom says I can stay over at his house next weekend," Kyle said between bites. Sarah nodded. "That's great. I think you two could use that time." Kyle looked up, studying her carefully. "You really are sorry, aren't you?" Sarah met his gaze, her voice soft but firm. "More than you know." Kyle gave her a small nod. "Good." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the clink of silverware on plates filling the air. Finally, Kyle looked up again, a playful glint in his eye. "By the way, Mom, Elijah says you owe him one of your apple pies. You know, as part of your redemption arc." Sarah laughed, the sound breaking free for the first time in what felt like forever. "I think that's fair," she replied. Kyle grinned, and for the first time in days, everything felt right. Not perfect, but right. The leaves had started to turn, coating the neighborhood in shades of gold and crimson. The chill of autumn crept into the air, carried on the wind, but inside the Thompson house, warmth was slowly returning. Sarah stood at the kitchen counter, peeling apples for the pie she'd promised Elijah. She worked quietly, slicing each piece with practiced care, but her mind wandered as it often did these days, back to that night, back to her mistake. "I'll never forget it," she thought as she placed another apple slice into the mixing bowl. "But I can learn from it." The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and sugar as the pie baked. Sarah hoped it was more than just a dessert, she hoped it was a gesture, however small, to show Elijah that he was welcome here again. That he always had been. Kyle burst into the kitchen later that afternoon, his cheeks flushed from the crisp air. "Elijah's coming over soon," he said, plopping his backpack onto the floor. "He says he can smell your pie from his house." Sarah smiled faintly, pulling the pie from the oven and setting it on the counter to cool. The golden crust crackled softly under the heat, the sweet aroma filling the room. "Good timing," she said. "I just finished." Kyle hovered over the pie like a hawk, his eyes shining with anticipation. "Think he'll forgive you once he tastes this?" Sarah looked at her son, amused. "I'm pretty sure forgiveness doesn't come in a pie crust, but it's a start." Kyle grinned, then turned serious. "I think he already has, Mom. Elijah's not the kind of guy to hold on to stuff like that. He just wants you to mean it." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "I do mean it. I'll keep showing him that." The doorbell rang just as the pie cooled to the perfect temperature. Kyle dashed to answer it, and moments later, Elijah stepped into the kitchen. His hoodie was pulled up against the chill, and his hands were stuffed in his pockets, but his smile, small but genuine, warmed the room. "Hey, Mrs. Thompson," he said softly. "Hi, Elijah." Sarah returned his smile, her voice steady but warm. "I'm glad you're here." Elijah's eyes darted to the pie on the counter. "Is that the famous apple pie Kyle's always talking about?" "It is," Sarah said, taking a deep breath. "And it's yours if you want it. I owe you that much, and more." Elijah chuckled softly. "I'll take the pie." "Thanks." Sarah watched as Kyle grabbed plates from the cupboard and began cutting generous slices, chatting excitedly about the new baseball season starting up soon. Elijah listened, nodding along and occasionally chiming in with his own thoughts, but his gaze would flicker to Sarah every now and then. Finally, as they sat at the table eating, Sarah turned to him. "Elijah, I hope you know how much it means to me that you came back here today." Elijah shrugged lightly. "Kyle said you were sorry. And you told me you were sorry, too. That's all I needed to hear." Sarah felt her chest tighten, a mixture of relief and regret swirling inside her. "It's more than that, though. I didn't just hurt you, I let Kyle down, too. And I let myself down. I need to keep proving to you both that I can do better." Elijah looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing her words. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said simply. "That sounds fair." Sarah smiled, her throat tight. It wasn't an instant fix. She knew that. But it was a bridge, one they could rebuild together. Over the next few weeks, things continued to settle into something closer to normal. Elijah was at the house more often again, and the easy banter between him and Kyle returned like it had never left. One Saturday morning, Sarah stepped into the garage to find the two boys rummaging through an old box of baseball gear. "What are you two up to now?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Getting ready for the season," Kyle replied, pulling out a scuffed-up glove. He grinned and tossed it to Elijah, who caught it effortlessly. "Coach says we're gonna start practice next week." Elijah laughed, holding up the old glove. "Man, this thing's been through some battles." Sarah watched them with a small smile. "Well, if you boys need anything, new gloves, cleats, whatever, just let me know. I'd be happy to help." Elijah glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face before he smiled faintly. "Thanks, Mrs. Thompson. I appreciate that." Sarah's heart swelled slightly at his words. They were simple, but they meant everything. That afternoon, the boys convinced Sarah to come to the park and watch them practice. She brought a thermos of coffee and sat on the bleachers, wrapped in her coat as she watched them toss the ball back and forth. Kyle's laughter echoed across the field, clear and unburdened, and Elijah's steady voice offered playful taunts and encouragement in equal measure. At one point, Kyle jogged over to her, breathing hard. "Did you see that catch Elijah made? He's on fire today." "I saw it," Sarah replied with a smile. "You two make a great team." Kyle grinned and ran back to the field, joining Elijah again. Sarah watched them as they played, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. That evening, Sarah sat at the dining table with Kyle as they ate dinner together. The table felt full again, even with just the two of them. "Hey, Mom," Kyle said suddenly, pushing his empty plate aside. "I'm proud of you, you know." Sarah blinked, startled. Proud of me? Yeah. Kyle shrugged, but his voice was sincere. For everything. For owning up to what happened and fixing it. It couldn't have been easy. Sarah felt her throat tighten, and she reached out to squeeze Kyle's hand gently. Thank you, Kyle. I'm proud of you, too. For standing by Elijah and for helping me see what I needed to do. Kyle smiled faintly, his expression softening. I think Dad would have been proud of us both. Sarah nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. I think so, too. Later that night, as Sarah washed the dinner dishes, she glanced toward the bookshelf where the watch now sat. It no longer felt like a source of guilt or shame, it felt like a reminder of lessons learned. A symbol of trust lost and trust rebuilt. She smiled softly as she dried her hands and turned off the kitchen light. The house felt whole again. Not perfect, but whole. And that was enough. The cool autumn breeze swept through the park, rustling the colorful leaves that littered the ground. Parents lined the bleachers, chatting and sipping coffee, their voices blending with the sounds of bats cracking and balls hitting gloves. It was the first baseball game of the season, and the energy in the air was electric. Sarah sat in the front row of the bleachers, a thermos of hot tea resting in her hands. She had arrived early to get a good seat and had spent the past half hour watching the boys warm up. She felt a strange mixture of nerves and pride bubbling inside her as Kyle and Elijah jogged onto the field together, laughing and joking as though the past few weeks had never happened. Denise arrived a few moments later, sitting down beside her. Morning, she said warmly, giving Sarah a small smile. Morning, Sarah replied, surprised but grateful for the gesture. You made it just in time. Denise nodded, her gaze following Elijah as he threw a perfect pitch to Kyle, who caught it with a satisfied thud. He's been talking about this game all week. He couldn't wait. Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes on the boys as well. They've worked hard for it. It's nice to see them happy again. Denise turned to look at her, a knowing expression in her eyes. It's nice to see you here, too. Sarah glanced down at her thermos, suddenly self-conscious. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be welcome again. Denise shook her head. Sarah, none of us are perfect. What matters is what we do after we've made a mistake. You've proven you're willing to change. That counts for a lot. Sarah felt her throat tighten, but she managed a small smile. Thank you, Denise. That means more than you know. The game started, and the boys played like they were on fire. Elijah's confidence on the pitcher's mound was unmistakable, his throws fast and controlled. Kyle, catching for their team, shouted encouragement from behind home plate, his voice carrying across the field. Sarah couldn't stop smiling as she watched them, two boys who had weathered a storm together and come out stronger for it. They were more than friends, they were family, and watching them reminded her of what really mattered. After the game, Sarah stood near the dugout with Denise as the boys packed up their gear. Kyle was the first to approach, his face flushed with excitement. Did you see that double play? He exclaimed. Elijah's arm was insane. Sarah laughed, nodding. You two were incredible out there. I'm so proud of you both. Elijah appeared behind Kyle, holding his glove in one hand and his water bottle in the other. His expression was more subdued but still content. Great game, Elijah, Sarah said softly, meeting his gaze. Elijah paused, then gave her a small nod. Thanks, Mrs. Thompson. There was no hesitation in his voice this time, just calm acceptance. Sarah felt a quiet wave of relief wash over her. You ready to grab burgers? Kyle asked Elijah, already bouncing on his feet. Mom's treating us. Elijah raised an eyebrow at Sarah, teasing. Even after the apple pie? Sarah chuckled. Even after the pie. You boys earned it today. Elijah grinned, and for the first time, Sarah felt the lingering tension between them lift completely. The three of them stopped at the local diner, a favorite post-game spot with checkered floors, red vinyl booths, and the faint smell of grilled burgers and fries. Kyle and Elijah slid into a booth across from Sarah, diving into their food with the bottomless appetite of teenage boys. "Don't inhale it," Sarah joked, watching them with amusement. Elijah grinned between bites. "We're athletes now. We need fuel." Kyle nodded seriously. "It's science, Mom." Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. Watching the two of them banter again was a gift she hadn't realized she'd missed so much. For weeks, her house had felt like a shadow of itself, quiet and tense. Now, it felt like life had returned, full of laughter and energy. Halfway through the meal, Sarah looked at Elijah. "You know, if you need a ride to practice or any games this season, you can count on me." "I mean that." Elijah paused, surprised. He swallowed his bite of burger and looked at her thoughtfully. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter now but sincere. "I appreciate it." Kyle looked between them, his face lighting up with a grin. "See? I told you my mom was cool." Elijah snorted. "We'll see about that." Sarah laughed, warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't just the banter, it was the ease, the comfort in their voices. The forgiveness. As the sun set later that evening, Sarah found herself sitting on the back porch, a cup of tea warming her hands. Kyle and Elijah were in the yard, tossing a baseball back and forth. Their laughter floated up through the crisp autumn air, blending with the distant chirping of crickets. Sarah leaned back in her chair, watching them with a smile. She could hear snippets of their conversation. "You're throwing too high. You've just got short arms, man." "It's not my fault." It felt like a small miracle, this sense of peace, of healing. The tension that had once weighed down their lives had lifted, leaving something better in its place. Sarah thought about how far they had come, how far she had come. The shame of her mistake would never fully leave her, but it had taught her something invaluable. It had shown her the importance of trust, of listening, and of recognizing her own blind spots. She glanced toward the bookshelf inside, where her father's watch now sat once more. It no longer felt like a symbol of her failure. It was a reminder of second chances, of redemption, of the strength it took to change. Kyle called out from the yard. "Mom, are you watching? Elijah's about to show off his pro pitching form." Sarah grinned, raising her cup in mock salute. "I'm watching. Don't miss." Elijah smirked and wound up dramatically, sending the ball soaring straight into Kyle's glove. The two boys hooped with triumph, their voices echoing into the dusk. Sarah let the sound wash over her, a smile lingering on her face. For the first time in weeks, everything felt whole. Not perfect, but whole. And that was enough.